Grant Remington stood at the window of his penthouse office, looking down at the city below. His reflection showed a man who had everything money could buy: the finest suit, the most expensive watch, and the coldest eyes in New York. At 45, he had built an empire from nothing, but the price had been his soul. The secretary's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Remington, the mayor's office called again about the charity gala tonight." "Tell them I'll be there," Grant said, adjusting his tie. These events bored him, but appearances had to be maintained. Ever since Jonathan Carter had stolen half his company 5 years ago, Grant had to work twice as hard to keep his position in society. The memory of Carter made his jaw clench. They had been best friends once, partners in building Remington Technologies from the ground up. Then came the betrayal. Carter selling company secrets to their competitors, using the chaos to gather board support, and forcing Grant out of key divisions of his own company. The lawsuit had dragged on for years, ending in a stalemate that left both men wealthy but bitter enemies. Grant checked his watch, a $300,000 timepiece that couldn't buy back a single second of his past. The gala started in an hour. His driver was already waiting with the Rolls-Royce. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as Grant's car glided through the city streets. He barely noticed the people anymore. They were all just faces in a crowd. Problems he could solve with a check or ignore completely. His phone buzzed with messages from gold diggers and social climbers, all wanting a piece of his fortune. He ignored them all. The car stopped at a red light near the old train station. Grant was about to check his emails when he heard the screams. "Help! Please, somebody help!" Something in those desperate cries cut through his practiced indifference. He looked up to see people pointing at the train tracks, and there in the fading light was a sight that made his blood run cold. A boy in a wheelchair was stuck between the rails. The chair's wheels had gotten caught in the tracks, and the child was struggling helplessly to free himself. The warning bells were already ringing. A train was coming. "Stop the car!" Grant shouted to his driver. Before the vehicle had fully stopped, he was already out the door running toward the tracks. People in the crowd were filming with their phones, but no one was helping. Grant could hear the train's horn in the distance, getting closer. The boy looked up at him with terrified eyes. Without thinking about his $10,000 suit or his own safety, Grant jumped down onto the tracks. The wheelchair was wedged tight, the wheels refusing to budge. "Hold on, kid," Grant said, his heart pounding. "I've got you." The train's horn blared again, much closer now. Grant could feel the rails vibrating under his feet. With desperate strength, he wrapped his arms around both the boy and the chair, yanking them free just as the train rushed past in a deafening roar. They fell backward onto the gravel, Grant cushioning the boy's fall. For a moment, they just lay, there catching their breath as the crowd cheered and emergency services finally arrived. "Thank you," the boy whispered, his voice shaking. "I thought I was going to die." Grant helped him sit up, checking for injuries. "What's your name, son?" "Matthew," the boy said. "Matthew Carter." The name hit Grant like a physical blow. He stared at the child's face, really seeing it for the first time. The same nose, the same chin. This was Jonathan Carter's son. His enemy's flesh and blood. But as Matthew smiled at him, a pure, grateful smile with no trace of his father's cunning, Grant felt something crack inside his chest. This wasn't Jonathan Carter, the man who had betrayed him. This was just a scared kid who had needed help. "Mr. Remington?" A reporter had pushed through the crowd, camera rolling. "You just saved this boy's life. What made you risk everything to help him?" Grant looked at Matthew, then back at the reporter. The answer surprised even him. "Some things are more important than money," he said quietly. "Some things are more important than old grudges." As paramedics checked Matthew over, Grant pulled out his phone and canceled his appearance at the gala. For the first time in years, something mattered more than maintaining appearances. He stayed with Matthew until the ambulance arrived, learning that the boy had been on his way to physical therapy when his wheelchair malfunctioned. "Will you come visit me at the hospital?" Matthew asked as they loaded him into the ambulance. His eyes were hopeful, innocent of the bitter history between his father and the man who had just saved him. Grant hesitated only for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I'll be there." As he watched the ambulance drive away, Grant realized his world had shifted. He had spent years building walls around his heart, focusing only on revenge and success. But one brave little boy had somehow found a crack in those walls. His phone buzzed, probably more messages about the gala. But Grant's mind was already somewhere else, thinking about a hospital visit and a child's smile that held no trace of the past's darkness. The sun had set completely now, but for the first time in years, Grant Remington felt a light growing inside him, the kind of light that money couldn't buy and hatred couldn't extinguish. The next morning, Grant walked into St. Mary's Children's Hospital carrying a stuffed bear and feeling completely out of place. He hadn't slept much, thinking about Matthew's smile and Jonathan Carter's betrayal. The nurses pointed him to room 304, where he found Matthew sitting up in bed, watching cartoons. "Mr. Remington," Matthew's face lit up. "You really came," Grant smiled, handing him the bear. "I promised, didn't I? And please, call me Grant." Matthew hugged the bear tight. "Nobody at school is going to believe this. You're like a real superhero." Before Grant could respond, a sharp voice cut through the room. "What are you doing here?" Sarah Carter stood in the doorway, her face pale with anger. She was thinner than Grant remembered, with worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago when she was still Jonathan's secretary. "Mom, this is the man who saved me," Matthew said excitedly. I know exactly who he is." Sarah interrupted. She turned to Grant. "Whatever game you're playing, leave my son out of it." Grant raised his hands. "No game, Sarah. I just wanted to make sure he was okay. Like you wanted to make sure we were okay when you tried to destroy Jonathan's career, when you forced us to sell our house." Matthew looked between them, confusion clouding his face. "Mom, what's going on?" Sarah moved to Matthew's bedside, protective. "Nothing, sweetie. Mr. Remington was just leaving." "But Mom..." "It's okay, Matthew," Grant said softly. "Your mother's right. I should go." As he turned to leave, Matthew called out, "Will you come back tomorrow, please?" Grant looked at Sarah, whose jaw was clenched tight. "That's up to your mother," he said carefully. Sarah's phone buzzed. She checked it and her face grew even paler. "Jonathan's coming," she whispered. "He's in the parking lot." Grant headed for the door, but it was too late. Jonathan Carter burst in, his expensive suit wrinkled like he'd slept in it. He stopped dead when he saw Grant. "Get away from my son," Jonathan growled. "Dad," Matthew tried to explain. "He saved my life. Hai pulled me off the tracks when I saw the news." Jonathan cut him off. "And I don't believe for a second it was a coincidence." "What are you really after, Grant? Using my son for some PR stunt?" Grant felt his temper rising but fought to keep his voice calm. "Think what you want about me, Jonathan, but I would never use a child that way." "Like you wouldn't use insider trading to steal a company?" Jonathan shot back. "That's rich, coming from the man who sold company secrets to our competitors." "Stop it!" Matthew's voice cracked. "Please, just stop fighting." The boy's plea hit Grant like a bucket of cold water. He looked at Matthew's face and saw tears forming. "I'm sorry," Grant said quietly. "You're right, Matthew. This isn't the place." He headed for the door again, but Matthew's next words stopped him. "I have physical therapy tomorrow at 10. Will you come watch, please?" Jonathan started to protest, but Sarah touched his arm. Something in her face made him pause. Grant looked at Matthew's hopeful expression, then at his parents. "If it's all right with your mom and dad," he said carefully. Sarah and Jonathan exchanged a long look. Finally, Sarah nodded slightly. "1 hour," Jonathan said stiffly. "Supervised." Matthew's smile could have lit up the whole hospital. As Grant drove back to his office, his mind was spinning. He'd spent years believing Jonathan was pure evil, but the way he looked at his son, there was real love there. And Sarah, she'd clearly been through hard times, but she'd stood up to both men to protect Matthew. His phone rang. It was his secretary. "Mr. Remington, the board is asking about the Carter situation. They've seen the rescue video, and they want to know how this affects the ongoing litigation." Grant watched the city pass by outside his car window. Tell them I need time to think." He hung up before she could respond. The truth was, he didn't know what to think anymore. For years, revenge had been his compass. his reason for getting up in the morning. Now looking into Matthew's innocent eyes, he wasn't sure where true north was anymore. Back at his penthouse that night, Grant found himself looking at old photos he'd kept hidden away. There he was with Jonathan at their college graduation. At the opening of their first office, at Jonathan's wedding to Sarah, where Grant had been best man. When had it all gone so wrong? And more importantly, could any of it be made right? His security chief called with the background check he'd requested on Matthew. The boy had been diagnosed with muscular dystrophy at age 6. The medical bills had started piling up right around the time Jonathan had made his move against the company. Grant sat in his dark office for a long time, thinking about choices and consequences, about a little boy's smile and an old friend's betrayal, about the true cost of revenge. Tomorrow at 10, he had a physical therapy session to attend, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to find his way back to the man he used to be. The man who had once been Jonathan Carter's best friend. The physical therapy room at St. Mary's was bright with morning sunlight. Grant arrived 5 minutes early, wearing casual clothes for the first time in years, just jeans and a sweater. He found Sarah already there, watching Matthew work with his therapist, Lisa. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Sarah said quietly. "I promised him," Grant replied, watching Matthew struggle to lift a small weight. "How long has he been dealing with this?" Sarah's voice was tired. "The muscular dystrophy showed up when he was 6. The doctors say—" She stopped, fighting. Tears. "They say it's progressive. Each year gets harder." Now Grant understood the worry lines on her face. They weren't just from financial stress. She was watching her son fight a battle that got tougher every day. "Where's Jonathan?" he asked. "Board meeting." Again. Sarah's bitter tone said volumes. "The company takes up most of his time now. Sometimes, I think he works so much because it's easier than watching Matthew struggle." Before Grant could respond, Matthew spotted him. "Grant, you came. Watch this. Lisa's teaching me new exercises." For the next hour, Grant watched Matthew work harder than many grown men he knew. The boy never complained, even when his arms shook with effort. When he managed to complete a new exercise, his proud smile lit up the room. "You're doing great, champ," Grant encouraged. He found himself moving closer, helping to steady the weights when Matthew's arms got tired. Lisa, the therapist, watched them with interest. "You're good with him," she said during a water break. "Most people get uncomfortable around our kids. They don't know what to say." "Matthew makes it easy," Grant admitted. "He's a brave kid." "The bravest," Sarah agreed softly. After the session, while Lisa helped Matthew get back in his wheelchair, Sarah pulled Grant aside. "I need to ask you something," she said. "And I need you to be honest," Grant nodded. "The day everything fell apart at the company, the day Jonathan made his move, did you really try to sell us out to Monroe Industries?" Grant stared at her. "What?" "No. Jonathan was the one who sold company secrets. I have proof." "What proof?" Sarah's eyes were intense. "Because Jonathan showed me emails from your account to Monroe's CEO, planning a hostile takeover. Those emails were fake," Grant insisted. "Jonathan must have—" "I have proof too," Sarah cut him off. "But mine doesn't match either story. I think someone else was playing both sides." Grant's mind raced. "What are you saying?" "Mom," Matthew called. "Can Grant come for dinner sometime, please?" Sarah looked at her son, then back at Grant. "Not yet, sweetie, but maybe soon." As they walked to the parking lot, Sarah's phone rang. Her face went pale as she listened. "What do you mean, denied?" she demanded. "The insurance approved this treatment months ago." She listened again, growing more upset. "We can't afford—" "No, you don't understand. He needs these sessions." Grant could hear Matthew behind them, talking excitedly to Lisa about his progress. "He made a decision. Sarah," he said quietly, "let me help." "We don't want your money," she snapped, but her voice shook. "It's not about money, it's about Matthew." Grant took out one of his business cards and wrote a number on the back. "This is my private line. When you're ready to talk about those emails, about what really happened, call me." Sarah stared at the card for a long moment before slowly taking it back. At his office, Grant called his head of security. I want everything you can find about communications between our company and Monroe Industries from 5 years ago. Everything. And I mean everything. Even deleted or hidden files. Sir, his security chief hesitated. Some of those files, they might implicate people still on our board. I don't care who they implicate, Grant said firmly. It's time we found out the truth. That evening, as Grant sat in his penthouse reviewing old company documents, his phone chimed with a text. It was a photo from Lisa, Matthew doing his exercises, grinning proudly at the camera. The message read, "He asked me to send this to you. You made quite an impression." Grant found himself smiling at the photo. Then he noticed something in the background, a visitor's badge on a man leaving the therapy room. He zoomed in, his smile fading. The badge showed the logo of Monroe Industries. Why would someone from Monroe be visiting a children's hospital physical therapy ward? Unless... Grant grabbed his phone and dialed his security chief. "I need everything. You can find on Lisa Thompson, physical therapist at St. Mary's. And I need it tonight. Something wasn't adding up." And this time Grant was determined to uncover the truth, not for revenge, but for a brave little boy who deserved better than to be caught in the middle of adult games. As he waited for the information, Grant looked again at Matthew's smiling photo. 5 years ago, he'd lost his best friend to what he thought was betrayal. Now he was starting to wonder if both he and Jonathan had been betrayed by someone else, someone who was still pulling strings behind the scenes. The game was bigger than he'd realized, and the stakes were no longer just about money or power. They were about a child's future, and maybe, just maybe, about healing wounds that went deeper than either man had admitted. Grant barely slept that night, waiting for information about Lisa Thompson. When his security chief finally called at dawn, the news was disturbing. "Lisa Thompson doesn't exist," the chief reported. "At least not the one working at St. Mary's. Her credentials are perfect fakes. And here's the weird part. She only started working there 2 months ago, right when Matthew Carter began his therapy." Grant's stomach tightened. What about Monroe Industries? That's even stranger. Their CEO, Richard Monroe, died 6 months ago, heart attack on his yacht. His son Marcus took over, and the first thing he did was approve a massive donation to St. Mary's Children's Hospital. Grant remembered Marcus Monroe, young, ambitious, and too smooth by half. They'd met at charity events over the years, but something about the man had always set Grant's teeth on edge. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "We need to talk. Can you meet for coffee?" 20 minutes later, Grant found Sarah at a small diner near the hospital. She looked like she hadn't slept either. "I went through some old files last night," she said without preamble. "Things don't add up. The day before Jonathan made his move against you, he got a phone call that changed everything." "What kind of phone call?" Sarah's hands shook as she pulled out her phone. "I recorded it. I used to record all his important calls, part of my job as his secretary. I never told him about this one." She pressed play. Jonathan's voice came through clearly. "You can't do this, he's just a child." A smooth young voice responded. "Children get sick all the time, Mr. Carter, but Monroe Industries has an excellent medical research division. One signature from you, and your son could be part of our experimental treatment program. Of course, that would require you to realign your business interests." Grant felt cold. "Marcus Monroe," Sarah nodded. "Jonathan wasn't betraying you. He was trying to save Matthew. Monroe had promised him access to a new treatment for muscular dystrophy if Jonathan helped push you out." "Why didn't he tell me?" Grant demanded. "We could have fought Monroe together." "Because they threatened Matthew directly." Sarah's voice broke. "And now they're doing it again. That's why our insurance suddenly denied coverage. Monroe Industries bought the insurance company last month." Grant's phone buzzed. A message from his security team. He opened it and froze. Lisa Thompson's real name is Angela Monroe, Marcus Monroe's sister. Sarah gasped. "The physical therapist? But she's been so good with Matthew." Or she's been gathering information, learning his weaknesses. "Sarah, when is Matthew's next session?" Sarah checked her watch. "In 2 hours." "Oh God." They rushed to the hospital, but Matthew's room was empty. A nurse told them Lisa had arrived early. saying she had special permission to take Matthew to the new therapy wing. "What new therapy wing?" Sarah demanded. Grant was already running, Sarah right behind him. They found a security guard who told them he'd seen Lisa wheeling Matthew toward the parking garage. "Call the police," Grant ordered, hitting the emergency stairwell. "And call Jonathan." They burst into the parking garage just in time to see a black van pulling away, Lisa behind the wheel. "Matthew!" Sarah screamed. Grant was already running to his car. "Get in." They tore out of the garage after the van. Grant's heart was pounding as he weaved through traffic, keeping the van in sight. Sarah was on the phone with the police, her voice shaking as she gave descriptions. "Why are they doing this?" she cried. "Because Marcus Monroe wants my company," Grant said grimly. "And Jonathan's have too. With Matthew as leverage, he can force us both to sign everything over." The van turned onto the highway, heading toward the industrial district. Grant's phone rang. "Jonathan, where is my son?" he demanded, following them now. "Monroe Industries." "Jonathan?" It was Marcus Monroe all along. "Meet us at their research facility on Industrial Drive." A pause. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. And Grant, don't let them hurt him." The van finally pulled into a secure facility with Monroe Industries, Logos. Guards started to close the gates, but Grant gunned the engine, crashing through. They screeched to a halt in front of a modern building just as Lisa was helping Matthew into a wheelchair. "Stop right there," Grant shouted, jumping out. Lisa, Angela, spun around, pushing Matthew behind her. "This doesn't concern you, Mr. Remington. Matthew is going to receive treatment that will help him walk again. Isn't that worth any price?" "Not if the price is his safety," Sarah said fiercely. Matthew looked confused and scared. "Lisa, what's going on?" "I'm trying to help you," Angela insisted. "My brother's company has developed a cure. Your father just needs to sign some papers. The only thing anyone's signing is your arrest warrant." Marcus Monroe stepped out of the building, looking irritated. "Always so dramatic, Grant. We're trying to help the boy. Our treatment could give him a normal life. All we need is for you and Jonathan to sign your companies over to more capable hands." "You're the one who set us against each other," Grant realized. 5 years ago, you played both sides, made us think we'd betrayed each other. Business is business," Marcus shrugged. "Now about those papers." The screech of tires cut him off as Jonathan's car arrived, followed by police cruisers. "Get away from my son," Jonathan roared, running toward them. Everything happened at once. Angela tried to push Matthew's wheelchair toward the building. Sarah rushed forward to stop her. Marcus reached into his jacket. Grant didn't think. He just moved. He tackled Marcus as police swarmed the scene. Sarah pulled Matthew into her arms as Jonathan reached them. "Mom? Dad?" Matthew was crying. "I don't understand. Lisa said she was helping me." Grant watched as the police arrested Marcus and Angela Monroe. Jonathan held his son close, tears in his eyes. "I'm so sorry," Jonathan said, looking at Grant. 5 years ago, when they threatened Matthew, I thought I had no choice." Grant remembered the photos in his office. Graduation, first office, best man at the wedding. He looked at Matthew, safe in his parents' arms. "We both did what we thought we had to do," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time we tried something different." Sarah touched his arm. "Thank you for everything." As the police took their statements, Grant watched Matthew with his parents. The boy was shaken, but safe. And maybe, just maybe, this was the start of healing more than just old business wounds. His phone buzzed, his board wanting to know what was happening. Grant smiled slightly. He had a feeling the next board meeting was going to be very interesting. Sometimes, it took a crisis to show what really mattered. And sometimes it took a child's bravery to teach grown men about courage, forgiveness, and second chances. The next few days were a whirlwind of police statements, press conferences, and hospital visits. Matthew had been scared, but was physically unharmed. The same couldn't be said for the relationship between the adults in his life. Grant sat in his office, watching the news coverage of Marcus and Angela Monroe's arrest. The reporters were having a field day with the story. Prominent business figures caught attempting to kidnap a disabled child. The Monroe Industries stock was in free fall. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Jonathan. "The board. Meetings in an hour," Jonathan said awkwardly. "I thought maybe we could talk first." Grant gestured to a chair. For a moment, both men sat in silence, 20 years of friendship and 5 years of hatred hanging between them. "I should have told you," Jonathan finally said. "When Monroe threatened Matthew, I should have trusted you, and I should have looked harder for the truth instead of believing the worst," Grant admitted. "We both let him play us." Jonathan pulled out an old photo from his wallet, the same graduation picture Grant kept in his desk. "Remember what we said that day? That we'd change the world together. Instead, we almost destroyed each other." Grant shook his head. "And Monroe almost destroyed your son." "Matthew keeps asking about you," Jonathan said quietly. "He doesn't care about the business stuff. He just knows you saved him. Twice." Before Grant could respond, his secretary buzzed. "Mr. Remington, Mrs. Carter is here with Matthew." Both men stood as Sarah wheeled Matthew into the office. The boy's face lit up when he saw them. "Dad!" "Grant, look what I can do." Matthew showed them a small stress ball he was squeezing. "Dr. Williams says I'm getting stronger." Sarah smiled tiredly. "He insisted on coming to show you both, and we need to talk about his treatment." They gathered around Grant's conference table. Sarah spread out medical files. "Monroe wasn't completely lying," she explained. "There is a new treatment program that could help Matthew. It's experimental, but the results are promising. The problem is the cost," Jonathan finished. "With everything that happened with the company split, our insurance—" "I'll pay for it," Grant said immediately. "No," Jonathan started to object. "Yes." Sarah cut him off firmly. "Jonathan, this isn't about pride or the past. This is about Matthew." Matthew looked between all three adults. "Are you guys friends again? Because I'd really like that." The simple honesty of a child's question cut through years of corporate warfare. Grant looked at his old friend. "What do you say, Jonathan? Maybe it's time to rebuild, not just the company." "Everything." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. "Partners?" Grant shook it. "Partners." Matthew cheered, then looked thoughtful. "Does this mean I can come visit the office sometimes? Mom says you have a helicopter on the roof." They all laughed, and for the first time in years, it felt natural. "Tell." "You what?" Grant said. "How about we all have dinner tonight? There's this great Italian place with the big fountains," Matthew asked excitedly. "Dad took me there once for my birthday." "That's the one. And maybe after dinner, if it's okay with your parents, we could take a little helicopter ride." Matthew's eyes went wide. "Really? Mom, Dad, please." Sarah and Jonathan exchanged looks. "A short ride," Sarah agreed. "But first, you have therapy. With Dr. Williams." "A real doctor this time," Jonathan added grimly. "Not a Monroe spy." As they got ready to leave for Matthew's appointment, Grant's secretary buzzed again. "Sir, the board members are arriving for the meeting." "Perfect timing," Grant smiled. "Matthew, want to help your dad and me explain some changes to a bunch of stuffy business people?" The board members were shocked to see Jonathan and Grant enter together, with Matthew between them. But as the two men laid out their plan to reunite the company and fund a new medical research division focused on children's diseases, even the most hardened executives found themselves won over. "And the first project," Grant announced, "will be continuing the legitimate research Monroe Industries was doing on muscular dystrophy. The right way this time. No threats, no schemes, just honest work to help kids like Matthew." One board member raised his hand. "The cost will be worth it," Jonathan cut him off. "Some things are more important than profit margins." After the meeting, as Sarah took Matthew to therapy, Jonathan lingered in Grant's office. "You know," he said, "Matthew's birthday is next month. He'll be 11. Grant nodded, remembering all the birthdays he'd missed. "Sarah usually puts together a small party at the house," Jonathan continued. "Nothing fancy, just family." "Are you asking me to come?" Grant smiled. "Well, you are family. At least you used to be, and Matthew would love it." Grant thought about the past 5 years, the loneliness, the bitterness, the empty victory of revenge. And he thought about a brave boy who had somehow brought healing to wounds that seemed unhealable. "I'll be there," he said. "But first, we have a helicopter ride to plan." As he watched Jonathan leave, Grant noticed the old graduation photo on his desk. Two young men ready to take on the world together. Maybe they still could, but this time with better priorities and a clearer understanding of what really mattered. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, a photo of Matthew at therapy, giving a thumbs up. The caption read, "His grip strength is improving. Doctor says the new treatment could start next month." Grant smiled, saving the photo. Sometimes the best business decisions had nothing to do with business at all. The Italian restaurant buzzed with evening activity as Grant watched Matthew taste his first bite of authentic tiramisu. The boy's face lit up with delight, and for a moment all seemed right with the world. But Sarah's worried expression told a different story. "The press won't leave us alone," she said quietly, while Matthew was distracted by dessert. "They're calling it the miracle on the tracks. How a rescue brought two business titans back together. They're camping outside our house." Jonathan squeezed her hand. "We'll handle it, we always do." "That's not all," Sarah continued. "Matthew's old school called. With all the media attention, they're concerned about security. They suggested we might want to consider other options." Grant put down his fork. "They're pushing him out. They said they're not equipped to handle the situation," Sarah's voice cracked. "Between his medical needs and now this circus? I don't want to change schools," Matthew said suddenly. They hadn't realized he was listening. "All my friends are there, and the science fair is next month. I've been working on my project all year." Grant and Jonathan exchanged looks. It was the same look they used to share when facing a business challenge, the one that said they had each other's backs. "What's your science project about?" Grant asked. Matthew's eyes lit up. "I'm designing a new kind of wheelchair, one that can handle different types of terrain better. The fake Lisa, she actually gave me some good ideas before, you know." The adults went quiet at the mention of Angela Monroe. The betrayal still stung, especially for Matthew. "You know," Grant said thoughtfully, "our company has an engineering department. They might be able to help with your project." "Really?" Matthew's excitement was contagious. "Could we go see it?" "Tell you what," Grant smiled. "Why don't we have that helicopter ride now, and tomorrow I'll take you on a tour of the engineering labs?" Sarah started to object about it being a school night, but Jonathan caught her eye. "Let him have this, Sarah. After everything..." The helicopter ride was magical. Matthew's face pressed against the window as they soared over the city lights. Grant pointed out landmarks, while Jonathan held Sarah's hand, both parents watching, their son's joy. But the real magic happened the next day at the engineering lab. Matthew wheeled himself between workstations, asking intelligent questions that impressed even the senior engineers. His eyes sparkled with curiosity and hope. "This is amazing," he exclaimed, examining a 3D printer. "Could we use this for wheelchair parts?" The head engineer, Tom Chen, knelt beside Matthew's chair. "You know, we've been looking for inspiration for our new adaptive technology division. How would you like to be our chief consultant?" Matthew looked at his parents. "Can I, please?" Sarah hesitated. "His schooling..." "What if we could solve both problems at once?" Grant suggested. "The company has a private learning center for employees' children. Top teachers, small classes, full security. And it's right here in the building." "I couldn't ask," Sarah began. "You're not asking," Grant cut her off gently. "I'm offering. As a friend, as family." Jonathan put his arm around Sarah. "We could try it. Just for a while, see how it goes." Matthew was practically bouncing in his chair. "Does this mean I get to work on real inventions?" Tom grinned. "With your ideas and our resources, kid, you might just revolutionize adaptive technology." Later that afternoon, Grant found Sarah alone in his office, looking at the city through his window. "Thank you," she said, without turning around, "for all of this, but... I'm scared, Grant." She finally faced him. "Everything's changing so fast. The company merger, the school, Matthew's treatment. What if something goes wrong again?" Grant understood her fear. "Sarah, 5 years ago, we let fear and mistrust tear us apart. We can't let it happen again. It's not just that." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Jonathan, he's different when you're around, more like his old self. The man I fell in love with. I'd forgotten that side of him existed. He lost his way for a while, we both did. But Matthew, he's helping us find our way back." Sarah wiped away a tear. "He asks about you all the time now. Wants to know stories about when you and Jonathan were young, when you were friends. We're still friends, Grant said firmly. We just forgot for a while. His phone buzzed, a message from the engineering department. They'd scanned Matthew's original wheelchair design and created a digital model. The attached video showed a 3D simulation of the improved design in action. Look at this, Grant showed Sarah the video. Your son did this. While dealing with his condition, with the press, with everything, he still dreams big. Sarah watched the simulation, smiling through tears. He gets that from his father. Jonathan used to be like that too before Monroe made him. Choose between his dreams and his son. Grant's voice hardened. But that's over now. We're going to help Matthew achieve his dreams. All of them. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Jonathan and Matthew returning from the Learning Center tour. Dad, they have a robotics lab, Matthew exclaimed. And guess what? 3 other kids there use wheelchairs too. Can I start tomorrow? Please. Sarah looked at her son's hopeful face, then at Jonathan's tentative smile, and finally at Grant, the friend they'd almost lost forever. Yes, she said softly. You can start tomorrow. Matthew whooped with joy, then grew serious. Mom, can we get ice cream to celebrate? Grant knows a place with 27 flavors. The adults laughed, and for a moment the weight of the past 5 years seemed to lift. They weren't just rebuilding a company, they were rebuilding a family. As they headed out for ice cream, Grant's secretary handed him a note. The press wanted statements about the company merger and Matthew's story. Grant crumpled the note and tossed it away. Some stories weren't meant for press releases. Some healing happened in private, over tiramisu and helicopter rides, in engineering labs and ice cream parlors. And sometimes, he realized, watching Matthew choose between chocolate chip and rocky road, the biggest miracles weren't the ones that made headlines. They were the small moments of trust rebuilt, one scoop at a time. Matthew's first day at the company's learning center brought unexpected challenges. As Sarah helped him get ready, she noticed his hands shaking. Are you nervous, sweetie? She asked, adjusting his collar. What if they don't like me? Matthew whispered. What if they only pretend to be nice because of Grant? Sarah's heart ached. The old school incident had left deeper scars than they'd realized, but they needn't have worried. As soon as they entered the learning center, a girl in a bright purple wheelchair rolled up to them. You must be Matthew. I'm Jenny. Want to see our science lab? We're working on solar-powered robots. Matthew's face lit up. He looked at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. As the 2 children headed off, the center's director, Dr. Rachel Martinez, approached Sarah. Mrs. Carter, could we talk for a moment? In her office, Dr. Martinez pulled out Matthew's medical file. I've reviewed his condition. We'll need to coordinate with his new medical team about the experimental treatment. Of course, Sarah tensed, waiting for the usual rejection. Instead, Dr. Martinez smiled warmly. We have 3 other students with muscular dystrophy. Our staff is fully trained. Matthew will have support here, both medical and emotional. Sarah felt tears, threatening. After years of fighting to get Matthew what he needed, this simple acceptance seemed almost too good to be true. Meanwhile, in the company's main conference room, Grant and Jonathan faced their own challenges. The board was reviewing the merger plans, and not everyone was happy. This is too personal, argued Richard Stevens, their oldest board member. We're running a business, not a charity. You're right, Grant replied calmly. We are running a business, and our new adaptive technology division, inspired by Matthew's designs, already has 3 major companies interested in partnerships. Jonathan stepped in. The medical research division isn't just about my son. It's about opening new markets, developing patents, creating solutions for millions of families like ours. And the Learning Center, another board member asked skeptically, is already attracting top talent, Grant countered. 3 senior engineers accepted our offers specifically because we provide education for special needs children. Sometimes doing good is good business. The meeting ended with tentative approval, but both men knew they had more convincing to do. Later that afternoon, they visited the engineering lab, where Matthew was showing Jenny his wheelchair designs. See, if we adjust the wheelbase here, he was explaining, it could handle stairs better. Jenny's eyes sparkled. And what if we added stabilizers, like on my dad's motorcycle? The two children were so absorbed in their discussion, they didn't notice the adults watching. Young love? Grant teased quietly. Jonathan tensed slightly. They're just kids. I know. But it's nice to see him with a friend who understands what he's going through. Before Jonathan could respond, Tom Chen hurried up with exciting news. The first prototype is ready. Matthew, want to see your design come to life? The wheelchair prototype was beautiful, sleek, modern, and painted Matthew's favorite shade of blue. But when Matthew tried to transfer into it, his arms trembled more than usual. I don't feel so good, he mumbled. Sarah rushed forward just as Matthew's eyes rolled back. The room erupted in panic. Call an ambulance, Grant shouted. No time, Jonathan scooped up his son. The hospital's only 2 blocks away. My car's faster. They rushed Matthew to the emergency room, where Dr. Williams was waiting. After a tense examination, he emerged with news. It's not a setback, he assured them. His body's just adjusting to the new treatment, but we need to modify the schedule. Sarah gripped Jonathan's hand. Will this affect his school attendance? Not if we coordinate with the Learning Center, Dr. Williams smiled. I already spoke with Dr. Martinez. They're setting up a rest area for him. Grant stepped forward. I have a better idea. We can convert my old office whilst it's right next to the Learning Center. Full bed, medical equipment, whatever he needs. Your office? Jonathan looked surprised. But you love that view. Some things are more important than views. Later that evening, as Matthew rested in his hospital room, Jenny rolled in clutching a blueprint. I worked on our design while you were sleeping, she announced. Added those stabilizers we talked about. Matthew smiled weakly. Sorry I scared. Everyone may, are you kidding? Now we can test the prototype's emergency response features and... She blushed slightly. Maybe you could help me with my science project too? It's about adaptive sports equipment. From the doorway, Sarah watched the children talk. Grant joined her quietly. Jenny's father was a motorcycle racer, he explained. Had an accident 2 years ago. She designs adaptive equipment for him now. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. She understands what it's like to watch someone you love struggle, to want to help. Speaking of help, Grant hesitated. There's something else you should know. The press got wind of Matthew's episode today. Sarah's face fell. Already? But here's the thing. They're not running with fear or scandal. They're focusing on the Learning Center, the medical research, the children designing their own solutions. It's inspiring people. That's what Matthew does, Sarah said softly. He inspires people to be better. In his bed, Matthew was now showing Jenny his treatment schedule. See, once we get the balance right, I'll be even stronger, strong enough to help test our prototype. And strong enough for the science fair next month? Jenny asked hopefully. You bet, we'll show everyone what kids like us can do. Grant and Sarah exchanged smiles. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs didn't come from corporate boardrooms or medical labs. Sometimes they came from children who refused to let their challenges define them. As night fell over the hospital, Matthew and Jenny were still talking designs, dreams, and possibilities. In the corridor, Grant, Jonathan, and Sarah discussed converting the office into a recovery room. And somewhere in the city, in a small workshop, a blue prototype wheelchair waited for its young designer to return, not just with his strength, renewed, but with a friend who understood both his struggles and his dreams. The road ahead would have its bumps, but they would face them together. As a family, as friends, as partners in something much bigger than business or medicine, they would face them with hope, with determination, and with the simple wisdom of children who saw possibilities where adults saw only problems. A month had passed since Matthew's episode at the engineering lab. Grant's old office had been transformed into a comfortable recovery room, complete with a hospital bed and medical equipment, but also filled with engineering drawings and project plans that covered the walls. The morning sun streamed through the large windows as Matthew and Jenny worked on their science fair project. They had combined their ideas, his wheelchair design and her adaptive sports equipment, into something new. If we add these attachments, Jenny explained, pointing to her drawing, the chair could convert for different sports. Basketball, tennis, even racing. Like a Swiss Army knife wheelchair, Matthew grinned. His color was better now, the new treatment schedule finally finding its balance. Sarah watched from the doorway, smiling at their enthusiasm. Behind her, Grant approached with coffee. "How's our young engineering team doing?" he asked quietly. "Lost in their own world," Sarah replied. It's good to see him so excited about something, but Grant noticed the worry in her eyes. "What's wrong?" Sarah pulled him into the hallway. "The hospital called. They found something in Matthew's latest tests. Dr. Williams wants to meet with us today." Before Grant could respond, Jonathan burst out of the elevator, looking agitated. "We have a problem," he said in a low voice. "Someone leaked details about our medical research division to the press. They're saying we're using sick children as test subjects." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "What? That's not true." "Of course it's not," Grant growled. "But I think I know who's behind it. Marcus Monroe may be in jail, but he still has friends on the outside." Inside the recovery room, oblivious to the adults' concern, Matthew was showing Jenny a new feature he'd thought of. "See? The wheels could have interchangeable treads. Street mode, sport mode, even rough terrain." Jenny's eyes sparkled. "My dad would love that for his therapy sessions. He's still trying to get back on regular motorcycles, but maybe something like this could help him transition." Her voice trailed off as she noticed the adults' serious expressions. Through the glass wall, "Matthew," she said softly, "I think something's wrong." The children watched as Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. Jonathan paced nervously and Grant spoke urgently into his phone. "Mom?" Matthew called out. "What's going on?" The adults composed themselves quickly, but Matthew knew that look. It was the same look they'd had when his diagnosis first came. "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetie." Sarah tried to smile. "But we need to go see Dr. Williams this afternoon." "Can Jenny come?" Matthew asked hopefully. "We were going to finish the conversion mechanism design. I actually need to go too," Jenny said, understanding the situation. "Dad has therapy today, but I'll bring the new sketches tomorrow, okay?" After Jenny left, Matthew confronted his parents and Grant. "Stop treating me like a baby. What's really happening?" The three adults exchanged looks. Finally, Jonathan sat down next to his son. "Some people are saying mean things about the company," he explained, "about the medical research we're doing to help kids like you. Because of me." Matthew's voice trembled. "No, sweetheart," Sarah rushed to reassure him, "because some people are afraid of new things, of change. But that's not all, is it?" Matthew was too perceptive for his own good. "There's something about my tests too." Grant stepped forward. "Matthew, you're right. You're not a baby. You deserve the truth. Yes, we're going to see Dr. Williams about your tests, and yes, we're dealing with some problems at the company. But you know what? What? You've taught us all something important. Remember when you were stuck on those train tracks? Everyone else just watched. But someone had to take action, had to believe things could be different." Matthew nodded slowly. "Like with our wheelchair design, Jenny and I saw a problem, and instead of just accepting it, you decided to fix it," Grant finished. "That's what we're going to do too. Fix things. Together." The meeting with Dr. Williams later that day brought mixed news. The treatment was working, but slower than hoped. They needed to adjust the protocol again. "It's like his body is fighting against itself," Dr. Williams explained. "The medication is helping his muscles, but it's putting stress on his heart." Sarah gripped Jonathan's hand so hard, her knuckles went white. "What are our options?" Grant asked. He had insisted on coming and no one had objected. "There's a new combination we can try," Dr. Williams said. "But I want to be honest, it's experimental. The risks—" "I want to try it," Matthew interrupted. Everyone turned to look at him. "Jenny told me something today. She said her dad could have given up after his accident, but he didn't. He keeps trying. I want to keep trying too." Dr. Williams smiled gently. "The treatment would require more frequent hospital stays. It could affect your school attendance. So we'll adjust," Grant said firmly. "The Learning Center already has a system in place, and the recovery room—" "And the science fair?" Matthew asked in a small voice. "Is in 2 weeks." Sarah nodded. "Plenty of time to finish your project between treatments." Later that night, after Matthew had fallen asleep in his hospital room, Grant found Sarah crying in the corridor. "I can't lose him," she whispered. "I can't." Grant hugged her awkwardly, and a moment later, Jonathan joined them. The three adults stood there supporting each other in silence. "Mr. Remington?" A nurse approached hesitantly. "There's a young girl here insisting on seeing Matthew. She says she has important design updates." They looked through the window to see Jenny in the waiting area, clutching her notebook, her father standing behind her wheelchair. "Let them in," Grant said softly. "Some medicine doesn't come in bottles." As Jenny rolled into Matthew's room, her presence seemed to brighten the sterile space. Even in sleep, Matthew smiled as if he knew his friend was there. The adults watched as Jenny carefully taped new drawings on his wall, adding to their shared dream of making the world more accessible, one design at a time. Sometimes hope came in unexpected packages. Sometimes it wore a bright purple wheelchair and carried engineering sketches. And sometimes it reminded grown-ups that the bravest hearts could be found in the smallest warriors. The science fair was 3 days away, and Matthew's hospital room had turned into an impromptu workshop. Components of their prototype wheelchair were spread across every surface, while Jenny made final adjustments to the control system. "Easy there, engineers," Sarah cautioned as she brought in Matthew's medication. "Remember what Dr. Williams said about rest." Matthew rolled his eyes good-naturedly. "Mum, we're almost done. Look, the sports conversion works perfectly now." To demonstrate, he pressed a button on the wheelchair's armrest. The wheels smoothly transformed, treads changing position for athletic use. Jenny beamed with pride. "We tested it with my dad yesterday," she said. "He says it's better than his professional sports chair." Sarah couldn't help but smile at their enthusiasm. The new treatment had been hard on Matthew, more hospital stays, more fatigue. But working on this project seemed to give him endless energy. Grant appeared in the doorway, his face serious. "Sarah, Jonathan's here. We need to talk." In the hospital corridor, Jonathan paced nervously. "The board called an emergency meeting. Someone's been spreading rumors that we're conducting illegal experiments on children. Our stock is dropping." "Monroe," Grant growled. "Even from jail, he's trying to destroy us." "That's not all." Jonathan ran his hands through his hair. "Some of our investors are pulling out. They're saying the medical research division is too risky." Sarah felt her world tilting. "Without those investors, we can't fund the research program," Grant finished grimly, "including Matthew's treatment." Inside the room, Matthew and Jenny were oblivious to the crisis, focused on their presentation for the science fair. "We'll call it the Freedom Chair," Matthew was saying, "because it gives people the freedom to do anything." Jenny nodded excitedly. "And look what else I added." She pressed another button, and small lights illuminated the wheel rims. "For safety at night, Dad helped me wire it." Their laughter carried into the hallway, where the adults were desperately trying to find solutions. "I'll put up my personal assets," Grant offered. "You can't," Jonathan shook his head. "The board would see it as a conflict of interest. They're already questioning our judgment because of our personal involvement." Sarah watched her son through the window, her heart breaking. "He's come so far, the treatment is working. We can't stop now." Mrs. Carter, Jenny's father, Michael, wheeled himself over to them. He'd been quietly listening. "Maybe I can help." They turned to look at him. Michael continued. "Before my accident, I had connections in the adaptive sports world. Professional athletes, equipment manufacturers, they're always looking for innovations." Grant's eyes lit up. "The prototype is exactly what the market needs," Michael finished. "I've made some calls. 3 major sports equipment companies want to see it in action." At the science fair, Sarah realized, "Yes, if the kids can prove their design works, we could secure independent funding," Grant said thoughtfully, "separate from the medical research division." Jonathan looked worried, but Matthew's been so tired lately. "The presentation is something he has to do," Sarah said firmly. "You've seen him with this project. It's giving him purpose." As if to prove her point, Matthew's voice carried from the room. "Jenny, I've got it. If we adjust the angle here, it could work for winter sports too, like wheelchair skiing." Jenny's excitement was contagious. "Dad would love that," Michael smiled. "They make quite a team." The adults watched as the children worked, their heads bent together over technical drawings, their faces glowing with possibility. "You know," Grant said quietly, "maybe we've been looking at this wrong. We've been so focused on medical solutions, on fighting Monroe's accusations. When the real solution was right in front of us, Jonathan nodded. In a children's science fair project, Sarah wiped away tears. They don't see limitations. They just see possibilities. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Matthew's doctors adjusted his treatment schedule to ensure he'd be strong enough for the presentation. The engineering team helped polish the prototype to professional standards. And through it all, Jenny stayed by Matthew's side, their friendship growing stronger with each challenge. The night before the science fair, Sarah found Matthew still awake in his hospital bed, looking at photos on his tablet. "What's that, sweetie?" "Pictures from the train tracks," he said softly. "From the day Grant saved me." Sarah sat beside him. "You've come so far since then." "Mom, even if the treatment doesn't work perfectly, I'm going to be okay, right? Because now I know I can help other people, even from my wheelchair." Sarah hugged him tight, crying softly. "You're more than okay, Matthew. You're amazing." In the corridor, Grant and Jonathan stood watching. "Remember when we thought we had all the answers?" Grant mused. That business success was all that mattered. "Now look at us," Jonathan smiled, "taking life lessons from our kids." Speaking of kids, Grant nodded toward the waiting area where Jenny had fallen asleep in her wheelchair. Still, clutching their presentation notes, Michael wheeled over to his daughter. "She refuses to go home, says she has to be here for last-minute adjustments." "Like father, like daughter," Jonathan said. "You were the same way before races." Michael looked thoughtful. "You know, after my accident, I thought my life was over. But watching Jenny and Matthew, they don't see wheelchairs as limitations. They see them as opportunities to innovate." "Tomorrow's going to be a big day," Grant said. "Not just for the kids. For all of us." Sarah joined them, closing Matthew's door softly. "Whatever happens with the investors, we'll face it together," Jonathan finished. As night settled over the hospital, 2 children dreamed of changing the world, while 4 adults learned that sometimes the biggest miracles came wrapped in the smallest packages. And tomorrow, at a simple school science fair, they would all discover that hope didn't always come in medical breakthroughs or corporate victories. Sometimes it came in the form of a wheelchair that could transform, designed by 2 children who refused to believe in limitations. And sometimes the best medicine wasn't found in hospital rooms at all, but in the simple power of friendship, innovation, and the courage to keep trying. The morning of the science fair dawned bright and clear. Matthew's hospital room was buzzing with activity as Sarah helped him into his best clothes, while Jenny made final adjustments to their prototype. "Are you sure you're strong enough?" Sarah asked for the 100th time, noting the dark circles under her son's eyes. "Mom, I have to do this," Matthew said with determination. "Not just for us, but for everyone who needs a chair like this." Grant appeared in the doorway, looking sharp in his business suit. "The investors are already at the school, and the news crews." "News crews?" Jenny looked up nervously. "Your story inspired people," Grant explained. 2 kids designing the next generation of adaptive technology. The media loves it. Dr. Williams arrived for one final check. "Your heart rate is elevated," he warned Matthew. "If you feel tired during the presentation—" "I won't," Matthew interrupted. "Jenny and I have practiced everything. We're ready." The school gymnasium had been transformed into a showcase of young scientific achievement, but all eyes were on the central display, where the sleek prototype wheelchair sat under bright lights. "Look at all these people," Sarah whispered, scanning the crowd. Corporate executives in expensive suits mingled with parents and teachers. Camera crews set up their equipment. Jonathan squeezed her hand. "He can do this." "We can do this," Jenny corrected, rolling up beside them in her purple wheelchair. She wore a matching purple dress, and her father Michael beamed with pride beside her. The judges approached their display. Matthew took a deep breath and began their presentation. "Everyone sees wheelchairs as limitations," he started. "But Jenny and I saw an opportunity. Why should someone need different chairs for different activities? Why can't one chair do it all?" Jenny pressed a button, and the prototype transformed smoothly into sports mode. Gasps of appreciation rippled through the crowd. The Freedom Chair adapts to you, Jenny explained. Street mode, sports mode, rough terrain, even snow and ice with our winter attachments. Matthew continued, his voice growing stronger. And look at this. He pressed another button and the wheelchair's components shifted again. The seat and controls adjust for different body types and abilities. One design, endless possibilities. The judges looked impressed, but it was the corporate executives who were really paying attention. Grant could see them whispering excitedly among themselves. Then came the demonstration. Michael rolled forward in his regular wheelchair. Mr. Davidson was a professional motorcycle racer, Matthew explained. After his accident, he struggled to find equipment that could keep up with his active lifestyle. Mr. Davidson, would you like to try the Freedom Chair? The crowd watched in amazement as Michael transferred into the prototype. With a few quick adjustments, he was maneuvering through an obstacle course they'd set up, the chair responding perfectly to every command. The smart control system learns your preferences, Jenny explained. It adapts to your strength levels and movement patterns. And watch this. Matthew pressed a final button. The wheel treads transformed again, and Michael smoothly climbed up a steep ramp that would have challenged most wheelchairs. The applause was thunderous. Camera flashes went off everywhere, but Matthew wasn't done. This isn't just about wheelchairs, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gym. It's about freedom, independence, the right to live life without limitations. He looked at Grant, then at his parents. Someone once risked everything to save me. He taught me that sometimes you have to take a chance on people. That's what Jenny and I did. We took a chance on this idea. Now we're asking you to take a chance on us. The room fell silent. Matthew swayed slightly, and Sarah started forward, but Jenny steadied him with a gentle hand on his arm. The Freedom Chair isn't just our science project, Jenny added. It's our dream of making the world better, one person at a time. The judges huddled together, but the corporate executives were already moving. 3 different companies approached Grant and Jonathan simultaneously, checkbooks practically out. We want exclusive rights, one began. The patent potential, another chimed in. Wait, Michael rolled forward in the prototype. Before anyone signs anything, ask yourselves, what would this mean to people like me, to kids like them? This isn't just about profit, it's about changing lives. Grant stepped up. He's right, which is why we're proposing something different, a joint venture, multiple companies working together with proceeds funding pediatric, medical research. The executives looked skeptical until Jonathan added, with Michael Davidson as our adaptive sports consultant. Who better to guide development than a professional athlete who understands the needs firsthand? While the adults negotiated, Matthew finally let his exhaustion show. Mom, I need to sit down. But as Sarah helped him into his chair, the head judge approached with a wide smile. I think we can skip the deliberations. The first place ribbon is yours. Jenny squealed with delight, hugging Matthew carefully. Around them, camera crews rushed to capture the moment. Later that evening, back in Matthew's hospital room, the celebration continued. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, their blue ribbon, and an oversized check from the corporate consortium. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Sarah asked, adjusting his pillows. Tired, Matthew admitted, but happy. Did you see Jenny's face when they announced the winner? Speaking of Jenny, Grant entered with a surprise. Look who's here, Jenny rolled in, followed by her father and a man in a business suit. Matthew, Mr. Reynolds from the patent office has some news, Michael announced. Mr. Reynolds smiled. We've reviewed your application. The Freedom Chair design is officially patented, with both your names as inventors. More celebrations erupted, but Matthew was fading fast. Seeing this, Jenny shooed everyone out except his parents and Grant. Get some rest, partner, she said softly. We have a lot of work ahead of us. As the room quieted, Dr. E. Williams arrived with test results. His face was serious but hopeful. The excitement raised his heart rate. But look at these numbers. The new treatment combined with his sense of purpose. He's getting stronger. Sarah and Jonathan held each other, crying quietly. Grant stood by the window, watching the city. Lights twinkle, Grant, Matthew's tired voice called him over. Thank you, not just for saving me that day, but for believing in us. No, Matthew, thank you. You saved all of us, in your own way. As Matthew drifted off to sleep, the adults gathered by his bed. Through the window, they could see the company building where it all started. The sign now read, Remington Carter Adaptive Technologies. You know, Sarah said softly, when he was stuck on those train tracks, I thought it was the worst day of our lives. But it turned out to be the beginning of something wonderful. Jonathan nodded. Out of darkness came light, and out of fear came hope, Grant added. In his sleep, Matthew smiled, dreaming perhaps of transformed wheelchairs and purple-clad friends and a future full of endless possibilities. Sometimes the greatest journey started with a moment of crisis. Sometimes the worst days led to the best tomorrows. And sometimes it took a child's simple wisdom to remind adults that love, friendship, and determination could overcome any obstacle. The story that began on a fateful day by the train tracks had transformed, like Matthew's wheelchair, into something no one could have predicted. It had become a story of healing, not just bodies, but hearts and relationships too. And in the end, that was the greatest innovation of all.